You weren't a janitor, just a young woman with dust on her sleeves and too much quiet in her eyes. That's what the cadets thought as they marched past, laughing under their breath, never slowing down long enough to wonder why her hand always lingered on one particular glass case in the Academy's Hall of Honor. She didn't argue, didn't explain, just polished until the reflections gleamed and the metals inside stared back at her like ghosts she refused to forget. And one evening, someone finally noticed. Not a cadet, not an officer with fresh stripes, but an admiral who stopped mid-stride, turned his head, and pointed straight at her. Ivory Raven. Greenlight. The hallway froze. Every boot hit the ground at once. The girl with the dust rag suddenly wasn't invisible anymore. Before I take you into this story, let me ask you this. If you believe respect is not about rank or uniforms, but about the weight of what someone has carried when no one was looking, make sure to like and subscribe. Because what's about to unfold proves that legacies don't need a spotlight to shine. Elena Morales was 28, but to the cadets of Westford Naval Academy, she might as well have been part of the cleaning crew wallpaper. Too young to be taken seriously, too quiet to be worth their time. She rolled her cart at dawn, a plastic bucket rattling with sprays and rags, the smell of lemon polish trailing behind her like a faint shadow. When the doors closed on the mess hall and the brass voices of commanders filled the morning air, she was already in the main hall, wiping fingerprints from the glass that caged trophies no one had touched in decades. The cadets joked as they passed. "Make sure to get my reflection nice and shiny, sweetheart." Or worse. "Careful, she might dust you right into formation." Elena never flinched. She worked in silence, steady, methodical. The only sign that the words cut deeper than they knew was the way her hand would pause for just a second longer on the cold brass of a forgotten plaque, as though grounding herself in something they couldn't see. She had been working there for nearly a year, mostly invisible. The academy was a place of pride, tradition, and thunderous ego. Young officers with bars on their collars stormed the halls like conquerors of seas they hadn't yet sailed. They studied tactics, recited doctrine, barked at one another in voices borrowed from men who had earned them. And always, at the edge of their vision, there was the girl in the hallway, pushing her cart, dusting her cases. Some called her Sunshine, with smirks that made it anything but. Others didn't bother to look at her at all. To them, she was an accessory, like the squeak of sneakers against the polished floors or the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Necessary, but forgettable. But the cases she dusted weren't forgettable to her. They weren't glass and brass, not just shelves of tarnished metals, folded flags, and half-faded photographs. Each one was a story, sealed in silence. Elena lingered at case 17 more than the others. That one housed an insignia most cadets overlooked because it wasn't tied to any battle etched into their textbooks. Black and silver, a raven mid-flight, wings spread wide like it was carrying something unseen. The brass plate beneath reads simply, Unit Designation Classified. Service years, 1964 to 1991. That was it. No victories listed, no names engraved. Just silence. And a symbol that made Elena's chest tighten every time she touched the glass. Her supervisors thought she was peculiar. She works hard, but she stares at those cases like they're talking back. One of them said it half-jokingly, sipping his coffee while Elena crouched by the floorboards, polishing the base of a stand no one had cleaned in months. What he didn't know was that Elena had grown up with a picture of that raven crest taped inside a wooden box hidden in her closet. She had been 17 the first time she heard the name whispered, Ivory Raven, by a man she only knew as Uncle Marco, though blood had nothing to do with it. He had been a family friend, older, quieter than most, the kind who drank his coffee in silence and never once bragged about what he did. When he passed, her mother burned the letters, sealed the box, and said only one thing. "We don't talk about it. Ever." But Elena had memorized the symbol long before the fire turned those papers to ash. In her 20s, she drifted between jobs, waitressing, clerical work, even a stint at a call center that lasted all of 6 months before she quit in silence, just like she had arrived. She wanted something different, something closer to the marrow of truth, though she couldn't explain why. And when the maintenance position at Westford opened, she took it without hesitation. On the surface, it was a job. But in her bones, it was something else, proximity. She was walking among the ghosts that had shaped her, brushing her fingertips against their shadows, and though no one else could see it, she felt less lost here than anywhere else. The cadets never saw that. They only saw a girl with a rag in a cart. Once, Lieutenant Harper, a cocky second year with a sharp jawline and sharper tongue, stopped in front of her case while she was bent low, scrubbing the floor. "You know," he said, voice dripping condescension, "one day, when you're done polishing our history, maybe you'll get to see the real thing. That's if you can pass a fitness test." His friends laughed. Elena looked up, her eyes locking with his for a moment. Not angry, not bitter, just steady. She didn't respond, didn't give him the satisfaction. She only turned back to the floor and kept cleaning. But deep down, the words landed in a place she didn't let anyone touch. Day after day, she dusted, scrubbed, polished. And day after day, the cases whispered. Not in words, not in voices, but in the way the brass caught the light at dawn, in the way the photographs seemed to shift when no one else was looking. She carried those whispers with her like invisible weight. And though she never told a soul, she had started a notebook of her own. Tucked under her mattress at the Academy's maintenance quarters, it was filled with diagrams of insignias, sketches of crests, fragments of names she had overheard in passing. One page, marked only with the Raven, was worn thin from the pressure of her pencil, tracing it again and again. Then came the night that changed everything. A visiting admiral, returning unannounced from Washington, walked down that same hallway where Elena was dusting as usual. Cadets snapped to attention, shoulders square, chins lifted, the thunder of respect rehearsed into their very bones. Elena, rag in hand, kept her head low, focused on the smudge of a fingerprint on the corner of a glass pane. The Admiral's boots echoed closer, steady and deliberate. And then, he stopped. His gaze slid past the cadets lined like statues and locked onto the young woman crouched at the case. The air in the hallway shifted, silent, expectant. He pointed, his voice sharp, clear, and without hesitation. "Ivory Raven. Greenlight." The rag slipped from her hand. Every cadet blinked in confusion, unsure what they had just heard. But Elena froze, her breath catching in her chest. Those words weren't orders. They were a key, a code, something buried deep in the marrow of a history she wasn't supposed to touch. Not here, not like this. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her posture changing with each inch. No longer the invisible custodian, no longer the girl mocked for her quiet eyes and dust-stained hands. She stood tall, and for the first time, the hallway saw her. The hallway did not breathe after the Admiral spoke those words. It was as though the walls themselves leaned forward to listen, the cadets frozen in their immaculate lines, shoulders rigid not from discipline, but from something they could not name. Disbelief, fear, awe, and every eye tracked the old man's hand as he pointed, steady as a compass needle, at Elena Morales, the woman they had dismissed 1,000 times as a custodian with dust on her sleeves, a nobody with tired eyes and a rag in her pocket. Yet the Admiral's voice cut through the sterile light once more, deliberate and precise. "Ivory Raven. Greenlight." And the syllables fell like iron on tile, foreign to the cadets who had memorized acronyms and doctrines, but never those two words that didn't appear in textbooks or training manuals. Two words that belonged to a world so far beneath the surface it had no place in the daylight of their drills. But Elena knew them instantly, knew them in her marrow, felt them awaken something she had tried to bury, and the rag slipped soundlessly from her hand to the polished floor as if even gravity knew the moment had changed, her chest rising sharply, the echo of memory thundering through her as though no time had passed since the last time she'd heard those words whispered through the static of a secure line years ago, when she was 22 and still trying to convince herself she was too young to be there. That someone had made a mistake placing her in that dimly lit room with hardened men and women twice her age. People who spoke in clipped, coded sentences and carried themselves like shadows rather than soldiers. But the mistake had never been hers. It had been theirs for underestimating her. And she had proven it again and again, until one day the mission stopped, the unit dissolved, the names erased, the files burned, the call signs sealed into silence as though none of them had ever existed at all. And so she had walked away, traded the hum of encrypted radios for the quiet rattle of a janitor's cart, traded adrenaline for lemon polish, traded identity for anonymity, Because hiding in plain sight was easier than trying to explain a past she was forbidden to name. And yet here he was, this Admiral, this man with steel in his posture and oceans in his eyes, tearing away the veil with two simple words. And she could feel the weight of every cadet's stare pressing on her like judgment and disbelief. "What's Ivory Raven?" whispered one under his breath, his voice sharp with nervous laughter. And another hissed, "Why is he talking to her?" Wow. Lieutenant Harper, the loudest voice in every room, the same man who had mocked her crouched on the floor just days ago, shifted uneasily in his spotless boots, his smirk faltering, his jaw clenched tight, as if trying to hold back the sudden fear that maybe the punchline was him now, not her, because the Admiral had not so much as glanced at the cadets, not acknowledged their perfect rows or polished salutes. No, his eyes were fixed solely on Elena, as if the rest of the world were noise and she was the only signal worth hearing. And then his boots moved forward, clicking with deliberate rhythm across the hallway tile, each step striking like a gavel in a courtroom, measured, unhurried, unstoppable. And when he stood within arm's reach, the hush was suffocating, cadets stiff as statues, waiting for some explanation that would make the world make sense again. But the Admiral gave them none. He simply studied Elena the way a man studies the horizon before a storm, and then his voice. Low, steady, absolute. Report. Just that. One word. But it was not a request, not a courtesy. It was a command layered with history and recognition. A word he would never waste on a custodian, and the cadets felt it too, though they did not understand, their polished discipline cracking at the edges as they exchanged frantic glances, desperate for someone else to explain what was happening. But there was no explanation to be found, only Elena, 28 years old and carrying in her silence more weight than all of them combined. And for a long moment, she stood frozen, her breath shallow, the tide of memories crashing over her. Missions in rain-slick alleys, nights staring through greenlit scopes, coded transmissions whispered in windowless rooms, the faces of teammates who had disappeared into the void of never-existed files, and the crushing silence when they had told her the unit was gone, disbanded, erased, that she was free. To live a normal life now, free to disappear like none of it had mattered. But here, in this hallway where she had convinced herself she was invisible, the call sign found her again. And she realized that no matter how far she had tried to run from it, service never truly leaves you. It lingers, it waits, it calls, and no part of her wanted to shrink, to stay small, to let the cadets laugh forever. There was another part of her, the part she had starved for years, the part that had been waiting for this exact moment. And that part rose, straightening her spine, squaring her shoulders, pulling her chin up so that she no longer looked like a custodian at all, but like something far older, far steadier, far sharper than any of them had seen. And when she finally spoke, her voice was clear, calm, undeniable. "Awaiting instructions, sir." And the syllables rang through the hallway like the crack of a rifle, snapping every cadet's smirk into silence, freezing Lieutenant Harper's bravado mid-breath, their faces pale, their world tilting because nothing they had been taught had prepared them for this moment. And the Admiral gave the smallest nod, not one of surprise, but of confirmation, as though he had expected her answer all along, as though the past 6 years of silence and scrubbing floors had been nothing more than camouflage for the day the code would be spoken again. And suddenly the hallway did not belong to the cadets, did not belong to their ranks or their rituals. It belonged to her, Elena Morales, Ivory Raven, the ghost in their midst who had carried more than they could fathom, who had waited in silence while they laughed, who had endured invisibility without complaint, and now, with 2 words and 1 command, she had been unveiled, undeniable, unstoppable. And as the Admiral's gaze swept the stunned cadets, he said nothing further, because the truth was already roaring louder than any speech could, and in the silence that followed, they realized that respect had never been theirs to give, it had always been hers to claim. The Academy's hallways had never been this silent, not during inspections, not during drills, not even during the funerals of cadets lost too young. And yet as Elena Morales stood beneath the Admiral's gaze, the rag at her feet forgotten, the cadets realized they were no longer in control of the story, no longer the center of the room, for the Admiral had shifted the gravity itself, pulling all eyes to her. The custodian they had dismissed, the girl they had mocked, the young woman who now stood straighter than any of them, her posture not borrowed from textbooks or rehearsed from parade grounds, but born of something deeper, something lived, and the Admiral, without turning his head, spoke loud enough for every corner of the hall to hear, his voice iron and steady. "Do you know what you have in front of you?" The question was not directed at Elena but at them, the cadets frozen in their neat rows, uniforms pristine but hearts trembling, and no one answered because no one could. Not Lieutenant Harper with his polished boots, not the cadets who had laughed at her cart squeaking down the hallway, and when silence became too heavy, the Admiral let it hang a moment longer before stepping back, drawing from the folder tucked under his arm a single sheet of paper, crisp, heavy with weight no printer could carry, and as he unfolded it the light caught the watermark seal of classified clearance, the kind none of the cadets had ever seen in their lives, and he held it up not for Elena, who needed no reminder, but for the rest of them. "This," he said, "is the record of a unit you've never read about because you weren't cleared to, because the operations they carried out were so dangerous, so vital, that most remain sealed until the year 2075, and yet one of their own has been standing in this hallway every morning, polishing the trophies of men who could not hold a candle to her record, and you never saw her." A ripple of shame passed through the cadets like a chill, shoulders lowering, throats tightening, and Harper's smirk had long since vanished, replaced by the pale realization that he had spat on a legacy he couldn't begin to measure. But the Admiral wasn't finished. He turned his gaze back to Elena, and in that moment his stern expression softened just enough for those closest to see respect gleaming in the lines of his face. "Ivory Raven," he said with reverence, not command this time, but acknowledgement. "The missions you carried out save lives that will never know your name, and today, that silence ends." The words struck like thunder, and murmurs rose among the cadets, some leaning to one another, whispering, "She was one of them? That's impossible. She's only 28. But the Admiral heard and cut through their disbelief with calm authority. "Age doesn't measure valor, nor does rank, nor does a plaque on a wall. You think experience is stripes on your shoulders, but let me tell you, this woman led a covert extraction at 23 that entire divisions couldn't have pulled off. She walked into fire so that others could walk out alive, and then she vanished because the mission required it, because the unit dissolved and the world turned its back, and still she stayed ready, still she carried the watch." Elena lowered her eyes then, not in shame but in quiet humility, because she had never wanted this, never sought applause, never longed for the spotlight. She only wanted to serve, and when the service ended, she wanted to disappear, but the Admiral's voice would not allow her to fade again. "Respect," he said, turning to the cadets, "is not about who salutes first or who shouts the loudest. It is about who remains when the lights go out, who stands when the noise fades, who carries the weight, without demand, and that is what you ignored every day you walked past her without a nod." Harper shifted again, throat tight, and finally he broke, his voice strained, "Sir, but the Admiral silenced him with a raised hand, not cruel, just final. "No, Lieutenant, this is not about your apology. This is about your education, and today, you all learn that arrogance blinds and silence teaches, and if you forget that, you'll lose men before you ever lead them." The cadets bowed their heads as though standing at a graveside, and in that silence Elena finally spoke, her voice low but firm, carrying across the hall with the weight of lived truth. "I didn't dust these cases because I had to. I did it because every name here meant something to someone, and whether the world remembered them or not, I did, and I'll keep doing it, because service doesn't end when the uniform does." Her words cracked something inside the hall, the cadets' pride splitting to make room for reverence, and slowly, as though pulled by an invisible command, the first row straightened, boots snapping together, hands rising to salute, not because the Admiral ordered it, but because the moment demanded it, and one by one the entire hallway followed, until the air itself trembled with the weight of 100 salutes held in perfect silence, all directed not at a general, not at a flag, but at the woman who had once been invisible and now stood like a shadow made flesh, the embodiment of what they all claimed to aspire to. The Admiral let the moment breathe before stepping aside, his voice softer now, almost reverent. From this day forward, this hallway doesn't just house trophies, it houses truth, and that truth has a name. Elena Morales, Ivory Raven. And whether she chooses to serve again or not, you will remember that legacy doesn't ask for recognition, it commands it in silence. And with that, he placed the folder into her hands, a gesture of trust, of authority, of restoration, then saluted her sharply. The motion crisp, final, unyielding, and Elena, though tears burned behind her eyes, returned it with precision that reminded every cadet present that rank is temporary but respect, once earned, is eternal. And as the Admiral departed, boots echoing down the marble corridor, the cadets remained locked in their salutes until Elena lowered hers, and only then did they follow. And though she bent moments later to pick up the rag from the floor, when she stood again, the hallway no longer saw a custodian, no longer saw dust, no longer saw invisibility. They saw what the Admiral had seen all along, a warrior, a sentinel, a legacy alive before their eyes. And in the weeks that followed, a new plaque appeared beneath the Raven crest she had dusted so often, engraved with words none of the cadets would forget. Ivory Raven, proof that some watchers guard even in silence.